I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of Movie Star Magic. And this week we're going to be looking at the great career of Kurt Russell. Definitely one of my favorite episodes to research for and watch the movies for in advance. Kurt is one of my favorite movie stars. I watched a bunch of movies in preparation for this video, so it should be a fun one. But if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is break down an actor's movie career while trying to define what makes them such a great actor. What is that special sauce that they're able to bring to a movie that actually excels it? So many times we look at a sort of film history point of view from the sort of director, because that's an easy way to look at the sort of main author of the movie and how they sort of chart their career. However, let's not forget that actors have a huge influence in the type of projects that they choose and what they bring to the movie that of course help these great filmmakers deliver great movies. So I'm going to start off by breaking down the career of Kurt Russell, by breaking his career down into 3 different chapters with a defining role in each, trying to explain and understand what makes him such an interesting movie star and how his sort of career has changed, that sort of career arc, that overall journey. And then I'm going to end the episode by talking about his defining feature. What is that one thing that he brings to every single one of his movies that he's always bring, that sort of X factor that he can do that no one else can? You guys have been enjoying the series so far, so please do like the video and comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'd love to hear that fan interaction. That's the reason I do this show. So I'd love to hear it in the comments down below, your thoughts on Kurt Russell. But jumping into it, starting off with chapter 1 of the Kurt Russell career arc, I'm going to call this the Snarky Kid, because as I was watching a lot of his movies, I realized how integral the sort of early part was in terms of defining who Kurt Russell is. And in this sort of early part of his career, he's known as a comedic actor. And when I remember, like a lot of people probably seeing my first Kurt Russell movies, it was things like The Thing and Big Trouble in Little China and Escape from New York. And I just thought that, oh, he probably just got in with John Carpenter early and became his guy, and that was it. Not realizing that he really was this sort of Disney kid, that he was in a lot of these Disney movies throughout the 70s, and then he really had to sort of break that mold and to become the actor he is today. And how in many ways that sort of journey is very sort of key to understanding what makes him such an interesting movie star. So I wanted to really include this chapter because this early part of his career was his sort of defining feature before he was able to break out of that mold. So the Snarky Kid sort of element, this would be the Dexter Riley movies and a lot of the Disney movies that he did, in which he plays this sort of cocky guy who messes up but gets the girl in the end and ultimately solves it. And the movies don't necessarily hold up that well. They're not really his best work. But I think to define sort of and refine his comedic chops that we'll see later on in something like Overboard or Captain Ron. But it's interesting to see that really early on he was seen as a comedic actor, and he just tried to reprise that in Captain Ron and Overboard. But those movies are sort of flops, and for the most part his successes, particularly in the 80s and 90s, were these big mainstream action movies rather than the comedies he started with. And then what's interesting to see, though, is that I think for a lot of people the sort of demarcation point away from this would be something like maybe Elvis or Escape from New York. But what's interesting is in between that period, we actually had this really terrific Robert Zemeckis film, which I think is the sort of defining role of this early Kurt Russell comedic chapter, and that movie is Used Cars. And I think this is a pivotal movie because it's still comedic, so it's not a huge stretch for Kurt. That being said, it's not the sort of Snarky Kid. It is very much a young, rebellious kind of a movie. It has this sort of acid dip view of America, very cynical. That being even the plot of the sort of insanity of it. But that being said, what Kurt is able to bring is this extra level of dimension in a movie like the Dexter Riley series. Oftentimes Dexter Riley screws up and has to sort of fix up his own mistakes, but we still enjoy him as a character even though he's making mistakes. Similarly here with Used Cars, where this guy is clearly a jerk and a little bit of a slime ball, definitely kind of a slime ball, this used car salesman, but ultimately gets our love and appreciation and support because of the sort of ability that Kurt, I think, is able to bring, the sort of innate all-American likability that he has as a movie star. Of course, he's very funny. This is a joke a minute kind of a movie, and not only is he able to deliver those great lines of dialogue, but he's also able to deliver on the physical humor that's necessary for the film. And he has this sort of just classic movie star stuff, where he can take a page, a huge monologue of dialogue, he can sort of essentially just whittle it down to into a couple sentences and it'll serve just as much impact, or sort of glance a look and that be able to communicate so much, just because of his sort of ability to manipulate, of course, his face and his gestures and his persona. But I think ultimately through his eyes, that ultimately, even though he is this sort of snarky kid that messes up, he is this sort of young punk in many regards, particularly in something like used cars, he still has that humanity, he still has that sort of genuine goodness to him because of his ability to connect to the audience through his eyes, which I think is a really terrific and significant element that Kurt was really able to harness in early on in his career. Then in the second chapter, I'm going to call this the Unconventional Badass, which starts in 1981's Escape from New York, and it goes throughout the sort of John Carpenter stuff of The Thing, of Big Trouble in Little China, and then of course into movies like Backdraft and Stargate and Tombstone, a little bit more conventional in the 90s, but particularly in the 80s. I think Carpenter really used him well as a sort of action hero, but one that was able to still sort of slightly be on the joke. It is sort of meta in a certain respect. It is sort of a clear homage to a lot of the tropes. I mean, Escape from New York is very clearly a Western in terms of that sort of silent protagonist type. Yet that being said, I think in this sort of period here, the unconventional action hero, I call it the unconventional action hero because of the type of characters he plays, but also when we think of 80s action heroes, what do we think of? Sylvester Stallone, Arnold Schwarzenegger. What about 90s? Will Smith, Bruce Willis, Keanu Reeves. For some reason, Kurt Russell had big movie star hits in Backdraft and Stargate and Executive Decision and Breakdown and Escape from New York. I mean, these were hit movies that he's had throughout the 80s and 90s, all action movies. Yet for some reason, he's not seen in that element. And I think because, in part, he was less sort of interested in the self-flattery of someone like a Stallone, or of building a brand and just sort of picking interesting projects. And if you just take a look at these sort of three movies, the Carpenter movies in The Thing, Big Trouble in Little China, and Escape from New York, they're very different in the regard. I mean, Escape from New York is Snake Plissken, who's a very silent type. And then you have Big Trouble in Little China, Jack Burton, who is a talking guy, a mile a minute sort of a talker. Very different characters. In The Thing, he's very much more of a stoic leader type versus the lone hero in Escape from New York. So even though they're sort of Carpenter films, it is sort of the more unconventional type of a hero because of his ability to sort of bring in that sort of knowing meta ability in a lot of those Carpenter films, but also I think a lack of physicality in certain regards that makes him feel a little bit more believable, a little bit more of a Bruce Willis in that sense, rather than someone like a Sylvester Stallone, where you see someone in Sylvester Stallone, he's Rambo, he can do no wrong, whereas someone like a Bruce Willis or Harrison Ford, they're a little bit less physically intimidating, so they're a little bit more relatable, and I think Kurt sort of fits into that mold well. And I think the defining role in this has to be Escape from New York, playing Snake Plissken. Of course, he reprises that role in Escape from LA, but this is just an iconic action hero, this sort of Western hero, but I think sort of defined himself in his own with the eye patch, with the sort of cool, slick demeanor, and he is sort of that ultimate badass type. That being said, he is a little bit more scrappy than that. I think that's he's not sort of this Rambo type. He is a little bit more of a sort of schemer in that regard. He's not necessarily just a total clear-cut action, sort of clear, moral hero type figure. He is a little bit more skeezy and slimy and a little bit of a jerk, but he is still lovable in that sense because of ultimately his mission and his appreciation of those morals and the playing into that action hero mold. So subverting it slightly, but not totally sort of winking and being super meta Deadpool-esque about it, but still sort of playing within that genre and bringing something new and trying to bring something element to it. So just being sort of this cool action hero, being able to have that sort of vulnerability, but also still emphasize on those action moments. Breakdown, I think, is maybe a classic sort of Kurt Russell type of a vehicle, and he's so terrific in that as well. So think of that in this sort of period, but I had to go with Escape from New York as his defining role because Snake Plissken is just so iconic. And now going to the third chapter, I'm going to call this one The Elder Statesman, where in the sort of 90s, while he was being sort of unconventional, I think sort of later on he started becoming a little bit more stereotypical in movies like Escape from LA and even Stargate to a certain degree, where he's becoming less self-referential, less sort of subversive, and more just traditional and a little bit boring. And I think with that Miracle in 2002, he really starts to sort of transform into being the sort of elder statesman as we know it. So we have that movie in 2002, 2007, Death Proof. I mean, there's a classic scene where he's talking to the young patrons at the bar about all the TV shows that he was in, of which they recognize none of them, and he sort of clearly passed his prime there. And even in movies like Fast 8 or Guardians 2, they're very much directly riffing on his status as a sort of sci-fi legend and an action star legend, and being the sort of guy who was once big, who was sort of at the peak, now sort of doing these more villain turns. Is an interesting sort of development on his end. Now, if I was being probably true to the sort of actual definitions of this category of the elder statesman, I probably would have gone with, Christmas Chronicles as his defining role, or even something like Bone Tomahawk as his defining role. But for me, I have to talk about Miracle somewhere, so I'm going to put Miracle here, which I think is his probably best performance out of all of his movies, the most transformative definitely out of all his performances. That and Elvis would be sort of tied there, but for the most part in the 80s and 90s he was Kurt Russell, and we like him because he's Kurt Russell. But I think this sort of movie here really brought an extra element and showed us that, wow, no, this is a guy that even though he hasn't won an Oscar, he could be in more of these sort of dramatic roles. He doesn't always have to be the sort of smiling jerk kind of a sleazy protagonist that we see him in so many of these movies. He can be sort of transformative, and he doesn't do so with sort of a huge prosthetic makeup job. He does so with some funny suits and a solid accent, and really sort of transforms himself into a Herb Brooks, the coach of this Miracle Team USA team. And I think it's through Russell's performance where, if you take a movie like Any Given Sunday and Al Pacino, he's a guy who's big and over the top and sort of blows you off the screen. But particularly in this movie, in Miracle, and what Gavin O'Connor is so terrific is able to do as a director, is really bring us in. And then through Russell's ability to have this sort of more quiet, reserved role and performance, it actually brings us in to the movie. So he sort of does this really tricky balance where he's able to transform. He's not sort of playing so total sentimentality line that's easy to sort of fall into in a lot of these Disney movies. It does feel real, does feel authentic, does feel genuine, but it also doesn't feel like he's giving him too much credit, that he still is the leader. He's not the sort of best friend of all these guys. He has to be tough. He has to be the guy to call the shots, to make those cuts. But also because we see the home life, because we see his own personal story, we understand his story of, understanding that some of these guys have to get cut, and that's the tough part of his job, and he doesn't like it either. So it humanizes him. I think Kurt's able to do a great job humanizing him by being subtle, by sort of reserving that, and then just being sort of a transformative role. I really didn't see Kurt in this. It was a terrific job at sort of just embodying Herb Brooks and telling the story, this terrific true life story. Now jumping over into the defining feature, I called this video Kurt Russell, the lovable jerk, and that lovable jerk factor, I think, is his defining feature. What he's able to do is just be genuine and honest and earnest, despite his characters being most of the time, or many of the times, kind of insane psychopaths. I mean, if you really think about the plot of something like Used Cars, the fact that he has to get $50,000 so he can bribe a politician, so that he can become a politician and accept bribes, like there's no sort of earnestness or sense of morality in that film. And I mean, even just the fact that if you think about it, it's like, oh, his boss dies, but he doesn't want to give up the dealership, so he has to pretend that his boss is still alive, and then he digs up his grave and then puts him in a car and then sets that car on fire and throws it to an accident. It's like, and just sort of the stealing of all the ads, it's like insane. This guy is a total criminal and a jerk and has no ethics and morals, but we still kind of like him. I mean, even if a movie like Overboard, which is this fun, charming kind of romantic comedy, at its heart is about a guy who tricks this woman who he hates into becoming his, essentially, female slave that can cook and clean for him and take care of the kids and fulfill his needs. And it's like kind of this insane, dark, sadistic premise. But it's Kurt Russell, and we know that he can give you a couple of looks, a couple of lines that makes you believe in him, and we know that 3 scenes later on we can throw in a little scene that sort of explains it and gives him a little bit of a backstory. And that sort of ability, to, despite being these sort of kind of crazy jerk-esque protagonists, the fact that he's able to play these sort of interesting, different jerk protagonists, but still be empathetic and still be earnest, I think is a real flexibility and a real sort of flex tool in a filmmaker's toolbox. I mean, the fact that you can get a guy that can be sentimental, that can be sort of genuine, that can get on the audience's side, but have him do crazy things. I mean, Captain Ron is a perfect example of this, where time and time again he's doing these crazy, stupid things, but because it's Kurt Russell, there's a scene, or all it takes is one scene or one sort of apology, and you know what, he's Captain Ron, he's the best, he does things his own kind of a way, even though he's kind of putting his family in danger and you know, is sort of a huge con man. He's Captain Ron, and that's how he lives. So just the amount of flexibility that it gives a filmmaker, I think, is ultimately what makes Kurt so great, is because he has this sort of lovable earnestness that he can utilize, and utilizes so well that he doesn't actually do it in sentimental, sort of treacly kind of movies. He does it in these sort of cynical, more jerk, scumbag kind of a performances. And what that does, of course, is bring flexibility to the filmmakers. And that's what the point of the series is to talk about the fact that, yeah, a director can do this great stuff, but if he writes on the page one scene that is incoherent to the plot or incoherent to the character arc of the movie, that can sort of be written away, that can sort of be smoothed over just by casting an actor like Kurt Russell. And that's what Kurt Russell brings to the movie. And that's why he's made so many great movies, despite working with filmmakers that aren't so great. It's because of what he brings to the movie, and that's what ultimately the series is about. And I think that sort of lovable jerk factor that he has just gives so much flexibility for a filmmaker to sort of smooth over those errors and helps make the movie ultimately better. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. Let me know your thoughts on Kurt Russell. What are your favorite movies about him? I mean, we haven't even talked really much about Tango and Cash or Silkwood. He's done a bunch of terrific movies, and I hope you check out all of them and you're as much of a fan of him as I am. But that's about it. Until next time, stay tuned.